Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter, more dangerous world, where your job could earn you a fine velvet tunic, a steady meal, and a beheading if you overheard the wrong thing. So, dim the lights, let the noise fade, and picture the candlelit corridors of a royal palace, where behind every jeweled curtain and polished silver cup, someone was listening. Because while kings and queens ruled by divine right, their servants lived by a simpler rule: never know too much. It was a strange, unspoken game. One part obedience, one part espionage, and all parts survival. Let's start, as these stories often do, in the Middle Ages, that charming time when soap was optional, loyalty was negotiable, and discretion could quite literally save your neck. Royal households were enormous, bustling, and deeply political. A medieval king might have dozens of attendants, grooms, cooks, scribes, bedchamber servants, falconers, and the unfortunate souls who handled the royal underwear. And while titles like Keeper of the Privy Chamber sound quaint today, back then they were positions of immense trust. Because when you dress the king every morning, you see the bruises, the nervous tics, the love bites that shouldn't be there. You hear the whispers he mutters in his sleep. You know the real version of power: sweaty, anxious, and badly perfumed. And sometimes you know too much. Take Edward II, Saint, see fine second of England. For instance, he wasn't exactly the poster child for royal restraint. Edward had a habit of elevating his favorites, men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, far above their station. And naturally, everyone at court hated them for it. But who had to serve these despised favorites every day? Who polished their armor, poured their wine, and listened to their schemes? The royal servants, trapped between loyalty to the crown and the quiet knowledge that this whole situation was about to end very badly. When Edward's enemies finally struck, they didn't just kill his favorites. They went after anyone who might have known their secrets. Dozens of minor servants were interrogated, tortured, or simply vanished from the record. In royal politics, silence wasn't just golden. It was the only currency that kept you alive. Let's drift south to France, where the court of Louis XIII had an even more inventive approach to information management. Louis was famously paranoid, a man who trusted nobody, not even his shadows. He kept a network of spies disguised as priests, monks, and merchants. Even his own servants were often double agents. One unlucky valet reportedly disappeared after merely mentioning that he saw Louis speaking privately with an envoy. That was enough. No trial, no explanation, just one quiet removal from history. Louis believed that words are like arrows. Once loosed, they cannot be recalled. And so, he preferred to destroy the archer. But the French didn't invent this particular brand of courtly paranoia. The Byzantines had perfected it centuries earlier. In Constantinople, imperial servants weren't just attendants. They were walking vaults of secrets. The eunuchs of the Byzantine court, for example, served as trusted chamberlains precisely because they couldn't produce heirs. No children meant no dynastic ambitions. It also meant they could be very loyal until they weren't. Several Byzantine emperors were quietly overthrown by the very eunuchs who once dressed them. They were perfect conspirators, invisible, literate, and constantly underestimated. When your job is to whisper in the emperor's ear, it doesn't take much to start whispering against him. Naturally, when those plots were uncovered, the punishments were creative. Blinding, mutilation, exile to monasteries, all very polite, all very final. Let's drift to a slightly less brutal but equally absurd setting. Tudor England, because no one made palace drama quite like Henry VIII. His servants lived in a permanent state of confusion, trying to keep up with which wife was currently queen, which priest was currently in favor, and which head was currently attached. The king's groom of the stool. Yes, the unfortunate man in charge of helping Henry with his royal needs was one of the most powerful people in England. He handled not just the chamber pot, but the king's private papers, finances, and correspondence. It was a job that required absolute trust and no sense of smell. But that trust came with danger. When Henry turned on one of his courtiers, the servants went down with them. Letters were confiscated, households dismantled, and attendants tortured until they confessed to things they didn't even have the vocabulary to describe. So, while the groom of the stool was technically the king's closest companion, he also lived one bad mood away from the tower. Sometimes, of course, the servants were the ones who talked, and paid dearly for it. During the reign of Catherine de' Medici in France, her household staff were famously well informed. They handled her perfumes, her cosmetics, and, allegedly, her poisons. When rumors began circulating about her involvement in various mysterious deaths, the first people questioned were her maids and apothecaries. Most of them swore loyalty under interrogation. A few didn't get the chance to speak at all. Because, naturally, nothing says innocent like having your servants disappear right after they talk to investigators. But even outside Europe, "Man har dir quantity 20 fans." The theme was the same. In imperial China, servants at the Forbidden City lived under constant watch. Every movement was recorded, every conversation monitored. If a servant so much as looked at a concubine the wrong way, they might be executed, not because of what they did, but because of what they might know. One eunuch, Gao Guiying, famously kept a diary of palace scandals. When it was discovered, he vanished overnight, his belongings burned, his name erased from court records. It's as if the emperor wanted to make sure even his memory couldn't talk. By the time we reached the 18th century, royal households had learned to professionalize their paranoia. Servants signed oaths of secrecy. Letters were burned daily, and gossip, that great social currency, became a silent killer. At Versailles, the maids of Marie Antoinette were forbidden to speak about her habits outside the palace. Of course, they did anyway, and when pamphlets mocking the Queen began circulating in Paris, several servants were quietly dismissed. Dismissal from court, at that time, was social death. No one would hire someone who had talked. Ironically, the revolution that followed wasn't started by the nobles, but by the servants and workers who had finally heard too much. And yet, in every era, there were those who survived by mastering the art of invisibility. They knew when to speak and when to vanish into the background, when to bow and when to listen. They were the silent architects of power, holding more secrets than any noble, and living long enough to take them to the grave. If history teaches us anything, it's that royal servants were both indispensable and disposable. They dressed kings, fed queens, and comforted dying monarchs, only to be erased from the record the moment they became inconvenient. Which sounds nice, until you realize that his definition of mild correction could still involve confinement, forced confession, and lifelong penance. A medieval version of "this will hurt me more than it hurts you." And yet, despite the cruelty, some inquisitors found themselves genuinely unsettled by the sight of these children. One 16th century report describes an inquisitor in Toledo who refused to sign a death sentence until he'd spoken to the condemned woman's little boy, who kept crying that his mother hadn't done anything wrong. The inquisitor eventually approved the execution anyway, but afterward he wrote that the child's words troubled him more than any question of doctrine. A rare confession of humanity in an otherwise pitiless archive. But not every monarch spent their free hours under chandeliers and harps. Let's drift north to England, where royal recreation often meant something more lethal. The Tudors, for example, enjoyed a good hunt. And by hunt, we mean an elaborate day-long ritual of organized chaos. Henry VIII would rise early, slip into velvet hunting clothes that probably weighed more than most of his servants, and ride out with dozens of companions. Hunting was his gym, his therapy, and his Tinder all in one. He loved it so much that when he grew too large to ride easily, he built mechanical contraptions to hoist himself onto horseback. Which sounds like a joke, but tragically wasn't. He also used hunting trips to flirt, intimidate, and occasionally accidentally kill someone's deer. And when he wasn't charging through the forest, he played tennis, real tennis, the original indoor version played in echoing stone halls. He was good at it too, at least until his waistline declared independence. 1. Ambassador described Henry as never idle, which is a polite diplomatic way of saying hyperactive and terrifying. It's a quietly tragic pattern and yet somehow deeply human. The powerful can't exist without the powerless, and those who clean up after the crown always end up knowing far more than they should. So, tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine those silent figures moving through the candlelight, carrying trays, pouring wine, and pretending not to hear the whispers behind velvet curtains. The courtiers plot, the monarchs fret, and the servants keep their eyes low, their voices steady, and their secrets buried somewhere between the silverware and the throne. Because in royal history, survival wasn't about being loyal. It was about being forgettable. And for those who served too closely, perhaps that was the only mercy they ever received. The servants who spied on their masters. Hey again. If you're still awake, first of all, impressive. Most people would have dozed off somewhere around royal chamber pot. But since you're here, let's drift a little deeper into the quieter corners of the palace. The ones where loyalty starts to look suspiciously like espionage. Because sometimes servants didn't just accidentally know too much. They were told to, and in royal courts across history, that made them the most valuable and the most disposable people alive. Let's start in Tudor England again, because of course we are. The Tudors treated spying like a national pastime. While Henry VIII was busy marrying, divorcing, and decapitating, his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, was quietly building one of Europe's first modern intelligence networks. And who did he rely on? Not knights, not nobles, but servants. Cromwell understood that maids, footmen, and stable boys could go places diplomats couldn't. They saw things, heard things. Sometimes they stole things. One of his informants, a woman named Margaret Glynn, worked in the household of Anne Boleyn's brother. Her job? To report on Anne's moods, words, and private conversations, which, as you might guess, did not end well for Anne. Margaret's little notes were passed quietly to Cromwell's agents and later used as part of the Queen's trial. And when Anne was executed, Margaret disappeared, quietly retired, quietly forgotten. Because being a royal spy was never a lifelong career, it was more of a temporary arrangement. But England wasn't alone in turning servants into secret keepers. Over in Spain, the Habsburg court had a charmingly paranoid tradition called Los Confidentes, the confidants. These were servants planted in noble households to report gossip, sedition, and bad dinner manners directly to the crown. One maid from the court of Philip II supposedly managed to expose an entire network of rebellious nobles, all because she overheard them mocking the king's long prayers. For her loyalty, she was rewarded with a small pension, and then quietly sent to a convent. Because, naturally, once you've proven you can spy on nobles, no one really wants you around their dinner table. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Tsar's court took things to an entirely new level of icy paranoia. Peter the Great, the same man who modernized Russia by sheer force of will, was obsessed with loyalty. He created the secret chancellery, a cheerful little department dedicated to finding out who was gossiping about him. Servants were often the first people summoned for questioning. Who said what at dinner? Who laughed when the Tsar stumbled on the stairs? Who whispered that he was becoming too much like the West? Even the cooks were interrogated, just in case they'd been seasoning more than the soup. And here's the twist. Some servants decided it was safer to become informants than to risk being accused of something worse. So, they volunteered. They spied on their masters, reported every rumor, and prayed the Tsar's temper wouldn't swing their way next. It usually did. Now, let's drift east again, to the Ottoman Empire, where espionage was practically an art form. Inside the Topkapi Palace, thousands of servants lived in the Sultan's shadow. Many were eunuchs, others concubines, and all of them existed in a delicate hierarchy of whispers. The Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, was one of the most powerful men in the empire. He controlled access to the Sultan's harem and oversaw the education of hundreds of women who might someday influence imperial politics. But his real power came from his ears. Every conversation, every rumor, every tearful complaint from a jealous concubine, it all flowed through him. And he passed those secrets directly to the Sultan. Some of those eunuchs became kingmakers, quietly deciding who rose and who fell. Others, when accused of treachery, were strangled with silk cords, because, royalty liked their executions elegant. The French, naturally, took a more theatrical approach. At Versailles, everyone spied on everyone. The palace was a glittering prison where gossip was both currency and entertainment. Servants would slip letters between powdered wigs and corsets. Maids were bribed to share details of which courtier visited, which bedchamber, even the king's personal hairdresser, a man charmingly named Leonard, was said to trade. Secrets for jewels. When Louis XV's mistress, Madame du Barry, began to lose favor, it wasn't her noble rivals who sealed her fate. It was her servants, tired, underpaid, and all too willing to talk. And when the revolution came knocking a few decades later, the palace's own staff were the ones opening the doors. Let's drift to Italy for a moment, because in Renaissance courts, intrigue was as common as bad breath. In Florence, the Medici family ran their city like a paranoid soap opera. Every servant was both a helper and a hazard. Cosimo de' Medici famously said, "A loyal servant is worth 10 noblemen," which, coming from a man who poisoned at least 2 of his rivals, was both flattering and terrifying. His descendants continued the tradition, keeping their servants close and their spies closer. Letters from the time reveal that even cooks were paid to report who favored which faction. Imagine being halfway through seasoning a stew and having to decide whether to betray your employer or your conscience. Most picked survival, and sometimes the spying went both ways. Royal masters didn't just fear being overheard, they listened back. In 17th-century France, Cardinal Richelieu, chief minister to Louis XIII, installed spies disguised as servants in rival households. They pretended to be footmen, maids, even musicians. Their mission? To gather dirt, intercept letters, and report treasonous gossip. It worked. Brilliantly. Richelieu's web of informants helped him stay one step ahead of his enemies for decades. But, in a delicious twist of irony, he died believing half his own servants were reporting on him, which, to be fair, they probably were. Even centuries later, in Victorian England, the habit lingered. Grand country estates were full of maids and butlers who quietly passed information to newspapers or political rivals. The British upper class pretended not to notice, as long as it stayed discreet, but sometimes discretion failed. In 1891, the butler of a certain noble family sold private letters to a scandal sheet. The resulting uproar ruined reputations, ended marriages, and inspired a wave of new etiquette books on household discretion, which is Victorian for "don't talk" or "will ruin you." By now, you've probably noticed a pattern. Servants were invisible until they weren't. They lived at the heart of power, unseen but all-knowing. And history punished them for both talking and staying silent. It's a delicate paradox. The closer you were to royalty, the more dangerous your silence became. And the further you stood, the safer your ignorance was, because in palaces filled with gold and deceit, truth was always a liability. Dealing with children, he advised that they be corrected with mildness, taught proper doctrine, and spared the punishments of their parents. You see, the medieval executioner didn't only execute people. That would be too simple. He was, essentially, the town's all-purpose remover of unwanted things. He dealt with corpses, animal carcasses, sewage, disease, and whatever else decent folk preferred not to touch. If a stray dog became rabid, he'd handle it. If the market had too many beggars hanging around, he'd clear them. If there was a mysterious body floating down the river, well, someone had to fish it out. He was both the city's cleaner and its conscience, although no one ever thanked him for either. And yet, on paper, executioners were civil servants. They were appointed, salaried, and sometimes even unionized in their own bleak way. In many towns, they received official uniforms and budgets for equipment maintenance. That's the polite way of saying new ropes, new blades, and occasionally new saws. But beyond the paperwork, they were social ghosts. No one wanted to shake their hand. Literally. The executioner's touch was thought to bring bad luck. Children were told not to look them in the eye. Priests hesitated to give them communion. It's hard to make friends under those conditions. So most executioners kept to themselves, retreating to small gardens, pets, hobbies, and the occasional drink. Some became surprisingly good at other trades. A few even became healers. Yes, you heard that right. The man who took lives by day often tried to save them by night. It sounds paradoxical, but it makes sense. Executioners understood anatomy better than anyone else, for reasons we don't need to linger on too graphically. They knew how much blood a body could lose before death, where the bones joined, how muscles tore. It wasn't exactly medical school, but it was practical experience. So many offered services as bone setters or herbalists. People came to them secretly, especially the poor. The quiet joys of mud and mead hay. Everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of dirt floors, smoky thatch, and the soft, squelching sound of medieval fun. Go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. Maybe pull the blanket a little closer. Because tonight, we're asking the question no medieval chronicler ever bothered to. What did peasants actually do for fun? After all, we know what kings did. They hunted, feasted, plotted, and occasionally died of gout. But the average peasant, the nameless, mud-spattered millions who made up more than 90% of medieval Europe, they didn't have hunting lodges, or banquets, or imported wine. They had livestock, obligations, church bells, and, as it turns out, an astonishing talent for squeezing bits of happiness out of a life that, by any modern standard, looked fairly miserable. So let's start there, with the medieval village. Picture it, a cluster of wooden huts, thatched roofs sagging a little from last winter's snow, a muddy lane that doubles as the drain, and in the middle, the beating heart of entertainment, the alehouse. Now, to modern ears, that might sound like a grim start, but the alehouse was less a bar and more a social lifeline. It was where news was shared, songs were sung, and the local brewer, often a woman, called an alewife, poured the only safe drink in town. Because water, of course, was a bit of a gamble. Ale, weak and cloudy though it was reliably clean, mildly intoxicating, and, crucially, communal. So a typical evening might go something like this. After sunset, when the work was done and the animals were settled, a handful of villagers would drift into the alehouse. Someone might bring a fiddle, or, more often, a set of bagpipes that had seen better days. There would be singing, loud, enthusiastic, and rarely in tune. There might be dancing, too, though dancing in medieval England was less ballroom grace and more controlled flailing. And yes, there would be games. They loved games. Dice, for instance, were everywhere, despite the church's persistent disapproval. Gambling was technically sinful, which, of course, only made it more fun. Peasants wagered on everything from dice rolls to wrestling matches, from cockfights to who could throw a stone the farthest. And if you're imagining a group of serious, mud-caked farmers quietly tossing dice by candlelight, don't. Medieval dice games could get rowdy. There were shouts, accusations of cheating, and sometimes genuine brawls, which might sound alarming. But for peasants, that was recreation. They weren't exactly spoiled for options, but perhaps the most beloved entertainment of all came with the rhythm of the year, the festivals, and there were many of them. Despite the hard labor, medieval life was punctuated by a surprising number of holidays, literally holy days. By some estimates, peasants in 13th century England had close to 80 days off a year for religious feasts, fairs, and saints' days. Of course, that didn't mean they lounged about eating pastries, but it did mean they gathered, they celebrated, and for a brief while, they stepped outside the monotony of toil. Take, for instance, May Day. The arrival of spring was a big deal in a world where winter could and did kill. So on the 1st of May, villages across Europe erupted in song, dance, and various acts of questionable taste. Young men and women went a-maying, which usually involved heading into the woods at night to fetch greenery, and occasionally each other. The next morning, they'd return with garlands, ribbons, and stories that might or might not be suitable for church. The maypole, that tall, ribbon-wrapped symbol of spring, was the centerpiece. And while we might think of it as innocent, medieval clergy certainly didn't. Many of them complained about its scandalous implications, which, naturally, only ensured that peasants loved it even more. Then there was the Feast of Fools, a sort of early medieval carnival where social order turned upside down. Servants became lords, priests wore masks, and everyone, for one day, could mock authority. It was chaotic, irreverent, and loud. A kind of communal pressure release valve for a society built on hierarchy. Even the church, though it disapproved, often tolerated it. Because deep down, everyone understood that letting peasants laugh at the system once a year was safer than having them challenge it the rest of the time. But not all entertainment involved chaos or sin. Some of it was domestic, even tender. In the long, dark winters, families gathered by the hearth to tell stories, folk tales, legends, bits of gossip from neighboring manors. Storytelling was a living art, and since most peasants couldn't read, these oral traditions were their Netflix, their history books, and their therapy sessions all rolled into one. There were also songs, work songs, love songs, songs about saints, about lost sheep, about ale that was too weak or wives that were too strong. Music was woven into daily life, not a separate performance. People sang while working, while walking, while drinking. It wasn't necessarily good music, but it was theirs. And then, of course, there were the mystery plays. Religious dramas performed in towns and villages during feast days. These were usually organized by guilds and performed by local amateurs, with homemade costumes and occasionally questionable theology. Scenes from the Bible would be acted out on wagons rolling through the streets, complete with angels on ropes, demons in furs, and the occasional chicken wandering through the set. For many peasants, these plays were their only direct glimpse of biblical stories, but they were also funny, human, and sometimes downright bawdy. Imagine an audience of villagers roaring with laughter as Noah's wife refuses to get on the ark because she's still gossiping with the neighbors. That was a real scene. It was relatable. It was funny. And it kept people awake. Now, one of the great misunderstandings about medieval peasants is that they lived in constant misery. And sure, the life expectancy was short, the taxes were high, and dental hygiene was more of a concept than a practice. But peasants weren't humorless drones. They gossiped, flirted, and played pranks. We even have court records from manorial courts documenting their small-scale mischief. One man was fined for stealing his neighbor's pig and painting it to disguise it. Another for singing rude songs in the churchyard. There's even a record of a village in England where the locals got in trouble for holding a mock funeral for a dead crow, complete with mourners, candles, and a priest's hat borrowed without permission. These things sound absurd, but they mattered. They were the texture of life. The little rebellions that made the long hours and rigid hierarchies bearable. And then, of course, there was sport, if you can call it that. Medieval football was not the tidy, rule-bound game we know today. It was more of a mass brawl with a vague sense of direction. Entire villages, sometimes neighboring ones, would charge across fields, ditches, and rivers, chasing a leather ball stuffed with animal hair. There were no teams, no uniforms, and no real limits. Broken bones were common. So were property damages, and yet they loved it. Kings tried repeatedly to ban it, partly because it was dangerous, and partly because it distracted young men from practicing archery, which was considered more useful. But peasants didn't care. Football was freedom, a rare chance to let off steam, and possibly hit your neighbor in the face without legal repercussions. Other sports were equally chaotic. Wrestling was immensely popular. Archery contests, though encouraged by law, were also forms of recreation, and in winter, when rivers froze, peasants sometimes skated, not with blades, but on flattened animal bones tied to their shoes with leather straps. They pushed themselves along with poles, gliding across the ice in what must have been equal parts grace and terror. And then there were the festivals involving animals. It's fair to say medieval people had a flexible relationship with animal welfare. They loved cockfighting, bear baiting, and even goose pulling, a game in which a live goose was hung by its feet from a rope, and riders galloped underneath trying to pull its head off. Yes, it's as horrifying as it sounds, but context matters. This was a world where violence was entertainment, where the line between fun and brutality was blurred by necessity. Still, for all the roughness, there was joy. We can trace it in poems and songs, in the margins of manuscripts where monks doodled dancing rabbits and drunk priests. We see it in the carvings on church pews, little monsters sticking out their tongues, knights mooning each other, and peasants chasing pigs. It's as if medieval artists couldn't resist slipping bits of mischief into even the most sacred spaces. Because fun, after all, was not just about leisure. It was a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that life, however short and constrained, could still be sweet. So if you wandered into a medieval village on a rare afternoon off, what might you see? A group of men playing at wrestling in the green, children chasing chickens, or trying to catch frogs in the pond. Women chatting as they spun wool or prepared food for a feast, an alewife laughing as someone tried to pay for a second drink with a song, and in the distance, The faint sound of church bells reminding everyone that fun, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was on borrowed time. But they made the most of it. They always did. And so, as we leave our muddy, merry peasants to their dice and their maypoles, let's drift a little further into how the rhythm of their fun shaped the rhythm of their faith. Because in the medieval world, even joy had to answer the age before time. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a world without ticking clocks. No phones lighting up the dark. No glowing numbers hovering on your nightstand. Just the quiet hum of village life, guided by bells, birds, and, if you were lucky, a monk with a water jug. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's slip gently into the long, drowsy centuries when time wasn't something you kept, but something that happened to you. A time before. Time in the Middle Ages. Time was not really what it is today. It wasn't a number you could check, or a schedule you could miss. It was, more or less, a mood. A day began when it got light. It ended when it got dark. And somewhere between those 2 points, everyone just tried their best. Peasants, for example, didn't rise at 6 a.m. because no one had invented 6 a.m. yet. They got up when the rooster started yelling, or when the light hit the straw in their eyes, whichever came first. If it was winter, that might mean something close to 8 in the morning. If it was summer, it could mean closer to 4. The modern idea of punctuality, of being late, would have made little sense. You couldn't really be late if no one could tell when on time was supposed to be. If you said, "I'll meet you after sunrise," that might mean in 10 minutes, or in 2 hours, or never, if it started raining and you decided you'd rather not. But to understand how they did keep track of their hours, we have to step into the world that took it most seriously, the monastery. The monastic clock because, of course, it was monks. When everyone else was sleeping, drinking, or generally not caring about the hour, the monks were there, timing their prayers. The Benedictine monks, in particular, had a rigid schedule. They were supposed to pray 8 times a day. And because nothing says spiritual peace like a strict timetable, these moments were known as the canonical hours. There was matins, the deep night prayer, somewhere between midnight and dawn. Then lauds, for sunrise, prime, around the first light of day. Terce, Ripon van kan Fenthian Onei, sext and none, roughly mid-morning, noon and mid-afternoon, then vespers at sunset, and compline, before bed, except, and this is the fun part, no one could actually agree when these were supposed to happen. See? The monks didn't divide the day into 24 fixed hours like we do. Their hours were seasonal. A day hour was the daylight divided into 12 parts, which meant that in summer, an hour might last 75 minutes, and in winter, it could be barely 45. So, if you were a monk in January, congratulations. Your hour of meditation was about as long as a pop song. If you were one in July, better settle in, because your hour might feel like a double feature. This, naturally, made scheduling a nightmare. So, monasteries developed their own methods of keeping track. Water, fire, and wax, one of the earliest methods, was the clepsydra, or water clock. It was basically a pot with a hole in it that let water drip at a steady pace. When the pot emptied, you knew an hour had passed, or at least some amount of time that felt like an hour. Of course, this only worked if the hole didn't clog, or freeze, or evaporate faster than expected, all of which happened regularly. And because monks loved a good ritual, the job of maintaining the water clock was usually assigned to one particularly unlucky brother. Imagine being the official timekeeper in the 12th century, which really just meant the guy who stares at a pot of leaking water all day. Later, they got creative. Some used candle clocks, candles marked with lines that burned down evenly, more or less, but candles vary. Some burned quickly, some slowly, and drafts could ruin the whole system. So a gust of wind could technically reset the medieval equivalent of your alarm clock. And then there were incense clocks, popular in parts of Asia, but sometimes seen in European monasteries with trade connections. They released different scents as they burned, which was both practical and soothing. It's the sort of invention that makes you wish the Middle Ages had more aromatherapy and less plague. Bells and the world beyond the monastery. 4. Ordinary people, farmers, traders, blacksmiths. Time trickled out of the church. Literally, because monasteries had bells, and bells could be heard for miles. Every time a monk rang for a prayer, villagers took it as a cue for their own day. Wake up at lauds, eat at sext, pack up when you hear vespers. The rhythm of life became a long, slow conversation between bell towers and the fields below. In towns, the same system spread. By the 13th century, cathedrals had full-time bell ringers who had the delicate job of keeping everyone's day aligned without a clock. They relied on Sunday and occasionally just vibes. If you think your job involves guesswork, imagine being the man responsible for when thousands of people stop working, pray, and eat. and your only guide is how long the shadows look on the church wall. The sundial. Reliable only in theory, of course. Sundials were everywhere, mounted on churches, courtyards, and even portable ones that looked like tiny brass compasses. But they had one fatal flaw. They required sunlight, which, in Northern Europe, was about as reliable as royal marriage stability. A cloudy sky meant your sundial was just an expensive coaster. And in winter, when the sun barely showed up, people just sort of guessed. There were even noon markers, holes in roofs that let a single sunbeam fall onto a marked spot on the floor, showing when midday arrived. But again, if it was cloudy, no one could tell when lunch was officially justified. How time became a social concept for most people. Time wasn't something you looked at. It was something you felt. You worked from dawn until you were tired, or until the animals started acting like it was time to go home. If you were a peasant, your schedule followed the land. Plow when the frost lifts, sow when the sun returns, harvest when it all starts to die again. Nobles, meanwhile, had the luxury of wasting time entirely. For them, hours weren't to be kept. They were to be filled. Feasting, hunting, gossiping about which cousin was marrying which cousin. They measured their days not in hours, but in meals and scandals. The first mechanical clocks, and then, around the late 13th century, something miraculous and mildly terrifying began to happen. The first mechanical clocks appeared. No one is entirely sure who built the first one. Possibly in England. Possibly in Italy. Almost certainly by someone who had too much time on their hands. Ironically, these early clocks didn't have faces or hands. They simply rang bells at regular intervals, powered by gears, weights, and gravity. They were more public spectacle than tool. Massive contraptions built into towers, creaking and clanging their way through the hours. They weren't accurate, of course. They drifted by minutes, even hours, every day. But in a world where everyone had been guessing anyway, roughly correct was revolutionary. A world that started to tick by the 14th century. Mechanical clocks began spreading across Europe. Cathedrals, town halls, and universities all wanted one. Each was a statement. A city that could measure time had entered the modern world, and with it came a subtle shift in thinking. People started organizing markets, labor and prayer by the hour, not by the light. Wages were measured by time spent, not just tasks done, and being late began to exist as a concept, which is, arguably, when everything went downhill, because now, for the first time, people could be wrong about time. You could show up late. You could leave early. You could measure your life by the steady rhythm of gears instead of seasons. It was the beginning of what one medieval writer called the tyranny of the clock. Though, to be fair, that tyranny was just a bell that rang slightly too often. Let's drift forward. As the centuries moved on, clocks grew smaller, prettier, and more personal. They moved from towers into homes, and eventually onto wrists. But in the medieval world, timekeeping remained a hazy art, half faith, half machinery, entirely approximate. If you lived then, you might go your whole life without ever seeing a clock face. You'd know time through habit, through light, through sound, a life of rhythm, not precision, and maybe, just maybe, it was quieter that way. In essence, the unusual punishments faced by men accused of witchcraft were rarely dramatic spectacles of death, though those existed. They were social, psychological, and occasionally absurd. They were slow, deliberate, and persistent. They involved humiliation, labor, ritual, and quiet monitoring. And they reflected, above all, a society deeply invested in controlling the unknown, the inexplicable, and the slightly awkward behaviors of men who were thought to flirt too closely with forbidden arts. So, as we imagine these men walking slowly through cobblestone streets, carrying heavy loads, wearing bells, or sitting quietly in cages while villagers whispered, we can sense the odd, low-energy rhythm of early modern justice. It was not about spectacle alone. It was about slow, careful assertion of order, of social hierarchy, and of communal reassurance. And the men, however unfortunate, endured. Some resisted, some adapted, and some simply survived, quietly bearing the peculiar burdens of accusation. And in that way, these stories resemble us tonight, lying quietly, aware of subtle restrictions, observing invisible rules, and pondering the gentle absurdities of life. The unusual punishments of male witches remind us that history is not always about dramatic heroics or tragic finales. Sometimes it is about small indignities, careful oversight, and the slow, persistent pressures of community. A quiet beginning. Loneliness at the dawn of humanity. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back a very long way. Not just to a lost kingdom or a forgotten emperor, but to the beginning, the quiet, unlit edge of human history. Before palaces and politics, before writing and wine, before anyone had the luxury of being interesting. Tonight's question is simple, though not an easy one to answer. Did ancient people ever get lonely? It feels almost strange to ask. We imagine our ancestors huddled around fires, surrounded by their tribe. busy with hunting, carving, gossiping, and trying not to be eaten. Surely they didn't have the time or the emotional vocabulary to feel the slow ache of solitude that fills modern apartments at 3 a.m. And yet, they were human, same brains, same restless minds, same tendency to stare into the distance and think, well, that could have gone better. So, tonight, we'll wander through the ages, from prehistoric caves to ancient cities, from lonely kings to wandering monks, and see how humans, across thousands of years, have handled that quiet, private ghost called loneliness. You don't need to keep up. Just settle in. Dim the lights, and let's drift back together. It's easy to imagine early humans as constantly surrounded by others. Their tribe, their family, their hunting group. But even in those earliest communities, loneliness had a way of sneaking in. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic sites often find single dwellings, small caves or huts that were clearly lived in alone. One famous case is the Lazaret Cave in France, around 160,000 years old. Inside were traces of repeated solitary occupation. A single hearth, one sleeping spot, tools for one. No signs of communal meals or shared work. Someone lived there, came and went, and returned to their fire again and again. We'll never know why. Maybe they were a scout, sent to watch over the group's hunting grounds. Maybe they were ostracized, or maybe they simply preferred the company of their own thoughts. A rare and dangerous luxury in an age of predators. What's moving is that even in those solitary shelters, we still find signs of care, a shell necklace, a carved bone, a few flowers placed in the dirt. Small proofs that even when humans were alone, they tried to make the world less so. Because loneliness, it seems, isn't just about being isolated. It's about wanting to belong and remembering that you once did. Let's drift forward a few millennia to the first real communities, the early villages of Mesopotamia. Around 5000 BCE, as humans began settling near rivers and building cities like Uruk and Eridu, something strange happened. They became more lonely, not less. You'd think that being surrounded by people would help. But as societies grew, they also stratified. The same clay tablets that tell us about grain taxes and temple donations also whisper about alienation. People began to write about feeling abandoned by their gods, unseen by their peers, forgotten by their rulers. One of the earliest examples is a Sumerian lament sometimes called The Poor Man of Nippur. It's a story about a man so neglected by his community that he turns to trickery and revenge, a very human solution to feeling invisible. The text is almost 5,000 years old, but the emotion feels modern. No one listens to my words. My neighbors have forgotten me. I speak, and the air is empty. It's a strange comfort. Really, even at the dawn of civilization, people were already posting emotional status updates just in cuneiform. And then there's the Epic of Gilgamesh, our first great recorded story, and, perhaps not coincidentally, our first great exploration of loneliness. Gilgamesh, the proud king of Uruk, begins as a man surrounded by people but untouched by connection. His subjects fear him, his gods tolerate him, and his friend, when he finally gains one, dies. The entire epic, in many ways, is about what happens when someone realizes that even power can't protect them from solitude. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh wanders the wilderness alone, desperate to escape mortality. He meets gods, monsters, and the immortal Utnapishtim, and none of it helps. He ends the story right where he began. Still human, still mortal, still alone. It's remarkable that 5,000 years ago someone wrote that down, because in it you can hear the echo of every sleepless night since. The same restless wondering about meaning, company, and loss. Let's drift now to a quieter corner of the ancient world, to Egypt. The Egyptians were famously preoccupied with the afterlife, but they were also deeply aware of loneliness in life. In their literature, isolation was often treated as a spiritual disease. One haunting example is a text from the Middle Kingdom known as the Dialogue of a Man with His Bai. The Bai being his soul. The man, weary and isolated, debates with his own spirit about whether it's worth continuing to live. It's bleak, yes, but the tone isn't hopeless. It's contemplative. He isn't seeking company. He's seeking understanding. It's the earliest recorded internal monologue, and it reads like someone trying to talk loneliness in life. In their literature, isolation was often treated as a spiritual disease. One haunting example is a text from the Middle Kingdom known as the Dialogue of a Man with His Bai. The Bai being his soul. The man, weary and isolated, debates with his own spirit about whether it's worth continuing to live. It's bleak, yes, but the tone isn't hopeless. It's contemplative. He isn't seeking company. He's seeking understanding. It's the earliest recorded internal monologue, and it reads like someone trying to talk themselves out of despair. The Egyptians may have built massive tombs for eternity, but they also built small spaces for reflection. Little chapels, quiet gardens, shaded courtyards where a person could be alone, but not forgotten. It's as if they understood that solitude could heal, provided you didn't stay in it too long. The Greeks, of course, had plenty to say about loneliness, though they were too proud to call it that. For them, the ideal human was social, political, engaged. To be isolated was to be idiots, literally, a private person. That's where our word idiot comes from, a gentle reminder that in ancient Athens, being introverted was considered a civic failure, yet even so, Greek philosophers quietly redefined solitude as something noble. Socrates claimed to hear a divine inner voice that guided him. Diogenes lived alone in a barrel, occasionally throwing shade and literal objects at passing citizens. And the Stoics? They practically made loneliness into a virtue. Seneca, writing from exile, described solitude as the fellowship of the self, which sounds comforting until you remember he was also plotting political survival. Greek tragedy, though, was where loneliness came into full focus. Oedipus, Antigone, Medea, all stories about people who act from isolation, who find themselves cut off from community, sometimes by fate, sometimes by their own choices. It's as if Greek theater was society's way of sitting down together and saying, yes, it's awful, but at least we're all watching it happen. Now, let's drift east to China around the same time. In early Chinese philosophy, solitude wasn't seen as a curse, but as a kind of purification. The Taoists, especially, prized reclusion. They believed that stepping away from the noise of society was the only way to hear the rhythm of the Tao, the natural order of things. Poets like Tao Yuanming, who famously returned to his fields, left government life behind to live quietly among chrysanthemums. He wrote simple poems about drinking wine, tilling soil, and watching the seasons change. They're tranquil, almost drowsy, but deeply moving. One of his lines reads, "I built my hut in the midst of men, yet there is no noise of carts and horses." He found peace not in being alone, but in being contentedly apart. There's a subtle distinction there, one modern societies still struggle with. Being alone is physical. Feeling lonely is emotional. 3. Ancient Chinese knew the difference, long before we had psychology. Let's drift forward again, to the Roman Empire, where the loneliness of the powerful becomes almost its own genre. Roman emperors were surrounded by people constantly. Servants, guards, senators, and enemies pretending to be friends. And yet, they wrote obsessively about isolation. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent his nights in a war tent, journaling to himself. Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. You can almost hear him trying to convince himself that's true. Meanwhile, emperors like Tiberius and Domitian withdrew completely, surrounding themselves with suspicion and silence. Tiberius spent his later years on the island of Capri, attended only by spies and sycophants. According to one account, he spoke so rarely in his final months that his servants began whispering just to fill the air. It's a melancholy image. The ruler of the world, afraid of everyone, afraid even of his own voice, and yet the Romans still admired solitude. They built villas specifically designed for retreat, with private gardens, reading rooms, and baths. They called it otium, the quiet leisure of the mind. It wasn't about being lonely. It was about pretending not to be. Now, as we near the end of this first stretch of our wandering, let's pause for a moment. Loneliness, so far, has been both curse and companion, something to avoid and something to learn from, but it's also, quietly, a mirror. Every culture that tried to define it ended up revealing what it valued most. The hunter in his solitary cave. Survival. The Sumerian scribe. Belonging. The Egyptian thinker. Meaning. The Roman philosopher. Control. Different centuries. Same ache. And of course, there's another layer to all of this, one we can only imagine. What about the people who didn't have voices in the records? The shepherd on a hill, the potter's apprentice in a crowded city, the widows, the slaves, the travelers, the exiles. They left no journals or marble busts, but they too must have felt it. Archaeologists sometimes find small keepsakes buried beside anonymous skeletons. A carved bead, a shell, a bit of broken pottery with initials scratched into it. How did medieval people actually treat their dead? Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when death was, well, not exactly casual, but certainly familiar. When your average medieval person might attend more funerals than festivals. When the church bells tolled not so much as a rare event, but as part of the week's background noise. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's settle in for something a little melancholy. a little earthy, because tonight we're not talking about knights or crusades or plague-soaked drama. We're talking about what happened after. Specifically, what ordinary people did with the dead. The mothers, the farmers, the monks, the millers, all those quiet souls who kept Europe's graveyards so well stocked. You see, for all the attention we give to medieval kings and their glittering tombs, most people's journey through death was far more domestic. Less marble effigy, more wrapped in an old sheet and quietly buried behind the church. And yet there was a strange tenderness to it. Medieval. People didn't hide from death. They washed it. They touched it. They prayed over it. They lived among the bones of their own ancestors, sometimes quite literally. Let's drift there now, to a small village, sometime in the 13th century. It smells faintly of wood smoke and something else. Someone in the village has died. It's not unexpected. People didn't usually linger long. The average peasant might reach 40 if luck and weather were kind. So, when a villager died, the process began almost immediately. The body stayed in the home for a short while, usually a day, sometimes two, depending on the season and how well everyone could tolerate the smell of mortality in August. Family and neighbors came to help wash the body. This wasn't done by professionals. There were no undertakers yet. It was simply part of life, or the end of it. Women usually handled this part, as they did most of the intimate work of living and dying. They'd wash the face, the hands, the feet, not in disinfectant, but in blessed water, or sometimes just the cleanest water available. They'd close the mouth and eyes, if they could. Sometimes they couldn't, in which case they'd tie a strip of cloth gently under the chin to keep things in place. Clothing the dead was an act of quiet ritual. They might be dressed in their best shirt, or a simple shroud if the family couldn't afford burial garments. Sometimes people left instructions for what they wanted to wear. A monk's robe, perhaps, or the habit of a particular order, because many believed that being buried in the right outfit might speed things along in purgatory. Children, meanwhile, were often wrapped in linen swaddles, just as they had been in life. There's something oddly circular about that. Now, the next step was the vigil. For a night, sometimes two, the dead person stayed at home. Candles burned near the body, not so much for romance or respect as for practicality. They were meant to ward off evil spirits, and also, probably, rats. Neighbors came to sit with the family. They brought bread, or ale, or just silence. It wasn't a time of wailing and throwing oneself onto coffins. Not usually. Medieval mourning was quieter, more resigned. When death is that frequent, you learn to make peace with it early. Still, there was superstition. You couldn't just leave a corpse unattended, because everyone knew. In that way, people know things without evidence, that a restless soul could slip out and cause trouble. Candles, prayers, and the presence of the living kept it where it belonged. Dogs were sometimes kept away from the body, too, because, apparently, if a dog jumped over a corpse, the person might rise as a revenant. No one wanted that. It wasn't even clear what a revenant would do, but it sounded unpleasant. The burial itself came next. Now, we tend to picture grand stone churches surrounded by tidy little graveyards, rows of mossy headstones. That's a later romantic version. Medieval. Churchyards were usually chaotic. Graves weren't marked for most people. A priest would record the burial in church rolls. Sometimes, but there were no neat granite slabs. The ground was reused over and over again. You didn't get eternal rest so much as temporary residence. After a few decades, when the body had decomposed, the bones might be dug up to make room for the next generation. But don't worry, they weren't just tossed aside. Europe had a solution for that, and it's one of the eeriest yet oddly practical traditions ever devised: the ossuary. Ossuaries were bone houses, literal piles of skeletons, neatly arranged in chapels, crypts, or even under church floors. In some places, like Sedlec Ossuary in the Czech Republic, bones were turned into decoration, chandeliers, wall art, entire altars made of femurs, a bit over the top, but undeniably efficient. The idea wasn't grotesque to medieval minds. It was reverent. The bones of the faithful were still sacred, even after the flesh was gone. By storing them near the church, you kept them close to holy ground and reminded the living of their own future. Imagine walking into church each week and glancing at a wall of skulls that might include your grandparents. It wasn't meant to frighten. It was a kind of visual sermon. Memento mori. Remember, you too will die. It's the medieval equivalent of a motivational poster. If the motivation was quiet, spiritual despair, not all burials were so orderly, though in times of plague, war, or famine, mass graves were common. The Black Death in the mid-14th century made individual burials impossible in many cities. Whole trenches were dug, bodies stacked in layers, quicklime poured to speed decay. even. Priests stopped trying to bless each one individually. There were simply too many, and yet, even amid all that horror, there's evidence of care. People laid bodies facing east, as was traditional. They placed rosaries or little tokens in the folds of shrouds. Even in a pit full of hundreds, someone took time to arrange them properly. There's something quietly human about that. Let's drift away from the mass graves now, to something more personal again, to the world of the wealthy. Because, of course, medieval elites handled death differently. For the rich, death was a spectacle, a grand, drawn-out event, complete with processions, incense, and enough wax candles to briefly alter the local climate. Royal funerals could go on for days. The deceased might be embalmed, or at least something resembling embalming. The process was, shall we say, experimental. In 13th century England, for example, the body of King Henry VI was reportedly opened, salted, and wrapped in ox hides for transport, because they needed to get him back from Normandy to England without losing too many pieces. His mind sahod, bowels were buried separately. This became a sort of royal habit, the medieval version of splitting your assets. By the later Middle Ages, heart burials were popular among the nobility, literally, the removal and separate burial of the heart, often in a favorite monastery or near a beloved spouse. Richard the Lionheart's heart, for instance, was buried in Rouen Cathedral, while the rest of him went to Fontevraud Abbey. A touching gesture, though slightly complicated for archaeologists. The bones, the heart, the entrails, all in different zip codes, because apparently, even in death, kings like to be distributed evenly across their realms. For lesser nobles and clergy, embalming was sometimes skipped, in favor of something called mos teutonicus, the German custom. It involved boiling the body until the flesh separated from the bones. The flesh was then buried locally, and the cleaned bones transported home for a more dignified burial. The Church eventually banned this practice, not because it was grotesque, but because it felt theologically suspicious, too much like tampering with God's natural order. Still, it had its advantages. Traveling with bones is easier than with a decomposing relative. Medieval monasteries had their own customs. Monks, who lived closely together, also died together, often in predictable patterns of plague or old age. When a monk died, the community gathered around him to recite the commendation of the dying. Then they washed and dressed him in his habit, placed him on a simple bier, and buried him within the monastery grounds. Sometimes they even kept him visible for a day, so others could meditate on mortality. The monk's body became a spiritual teaching tool, a reminder that, as he is, so shall you be, which sounds like the worst pep talk imaginable, but in context, it was meant to be comforting. And then there were saints. Saintly bodies were a category all their own, where ordinary corpses decomposed inconveniently. Saints were expected to behave. The ideal saint didn't rot. Instead, they emitted a pleasant fragrance, known as the odor of sanctity. It's possible that this was wishful thinking, or an early form of coping mechanism. Bodies of famous saints were carefully guarded, sometimes even boiled down so their bones could be distributed as relics. Having a saint's finger bone in your church was excellent for tourism. The holier the bone, the better the pilgrim turnout. Naturally, this led to some creative forgeries. By the 14th century, there were enough relics of the true cross circulating to build a modest wooden cottage. But faith is flexible like that. Back in the villages, the relationship with the dead remained far more personal. Graveyards weren't just resting places. They were social spaces. People picnicked there, held markets, and occasionally even danced. Children played among the graves. Death wasn't hidden away. It was simply part of the landscape. What happened to the children of heretics? Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to an age when belief could kill you. When saying the wrong prayer to the wrong person on the wrong day could earn you a personal invitation to the stake. So, settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, because tonight we're not talking about the heretics themselves, the fiery sermons, the torches, the defiance. We're talking about the people they left behind, specifically their children. What happened to the sons and daughters of the damned, the little ones whose parents had been branded enemies of God, or witches, or unholy blasphemers, and then very publicly turned to ash, because someone had to look after them. And medieval Europe, in all its divine wisdom, had a remarkable range of ideas on what to do with them, most of them bad. Let's start by setting the scene. Somewhere in the late 13th century, the church was at its bureaucratic best, busy sorting humanity into neat piles labeled orthodox and burnable. The Inquisition, newly formalized, had spread across southern France, northern Italy, and Spain like a particularly joyless wildfire. The targets weren't just witches, not yet. Witches would come later. when Europe got bored and decided women were probably the problem. For now, the heretics were mostly Christians who were doing Christianity wrong. Take the Cathars in southern France. They were gentle, vegetarian, and unnervingly pacifist, the kind of people who would apologize if you stepped on their robe. But they also believed the material world was evil and created by a lesser god, which, to the medieval church, was roughly equivalent to tattooing Satan's intern on your forehead. When Pope Innocent III called a crusade against them in 1209, the result was the Albigensian Crusade, one of the most tragically efficient acts of religious slaughter Europe ever achieved. Entire towns were wiped out, not just for heresy, but for the crime of existing near heretics, which left, of course, a lot of orphans. And this is where things get quietly heartbreaking, because in a world that saw heresy as a contagious disease, the children of heretics were viewed as potentially infected. Their souls were thought to be tainted by proximity. So naturally, medieval authorities took action. Sometimes, the church insisted these children be taken from their families and raised by good Christians, which sounds almost compassionate until you realize what good Christian meant in 13th century Languedoc. Someone who had just watched their parents burned alive and thought it was the right thing to do. One contemporary chronicler describes it almost casually. The children of heretics were taken and given to the faithful, that they might be instructed in the true faith, which is a long way of saying they were kidnapped, rebranded, and expected to forget everything they knew. And if they were old enough to remember that forgetting didn't come easy, imagine being a child of 8 or 9, watching your parents dragged away by men with crosses sewn onto their tunics, and told that your family, the people who fed you, sang to you, tucked you in, were enemies of Christ. Then imagine being handed over to someone who sincerely believed they were saving you from eternal damnation by making you renounce them. That was the moral logic of the time, that salvation was worth the price of memory. The same pattern played out across Europe. In Spain, under the later Inquisition, it became almost administrative. By the late 15th century, Spain had perfected the art of paperwork-based persecution. When a heretic was convicted, which, statistically speaking, was nearly everyone brought to trial, the church confiscated their property. And since property often included the family home and source of income, the children were left destitute. In theory, the church might offer them charity. In practice, charity meant whatever was left over after the officials finished dividing the estate. The Spanish Inquisition kept meticulous records, though so we can actually read some of the outcomes. In Toledo, for example, one record notes that the children of the condemned were given a small pension from their parents' confiscated goods, just enough to survive, not enough to matter. Their family name would be permanently blacklisted. Marrying one of them would make your grandchildren ineligible for university, public office, or most guilds, because heresy, as far as the bureaucracy was concerned, was genetic. Let's drift a bit north now, into the Holy Roman Empire, where things got complicated, because everything there always did. German heretics were a varied bunch. Waldensians, Hussites, and occasional random mystics who just had too many opinions. Local princes handled things differently. Some burned heretics, others fined them. A few, in the name of Christian mercy, simply exiled them, which sounds humane. Until you remember, exile usually meant starving in the woods. For the children of exiles, life was a strange half-existence. They weren't executed, but they weren't safe either. If they followed their parents, they became beggars. If they stayed behind, they were orphans with living parents. Some princes tried to solve the problem pragmatically. They allowed the children to inherit property if they publicly renounced their parents. Errors. Picture the ceremony. A small, frightened teenager standing in front of a local bishop, forced to declare that their mother and father were wrong, sinful, and probably in hell, just to keep the family farm. The Middle Ages were full of these moments of quiet cruelty that somehow felt normal at the time. And then there were the Protestants, the heretics of the heretics. By the 16th century, Europe had entered its favorite phase, the Reformation. Suddenly, everyone was calling everyone else a heretic. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists. It was like a theological free-for-all. The problem is that when everyone's a heretic, no one's children are safe. Take the Anabaptists. They believed in adult baptism, which, to most other Christians, was borderline anarchy. They were persecuted from all sides, Protestant and Catholic alike. In 1534, in the city of Münster, a group of them tried to establish a New Jerusalem. It didn't go well. After the city fell, the surviving adults were tortured and executed, and their children, the ones too young to understand any of it, were scattered to surrounding towns and monasteries. Some were raised as Catholics, others as Lutherans, depending on which direction they ran. Their names disappeared from records, their parentage quietly forgotten. Generations later, their descendants might never have known they came from heretics at all. The Church, in its infinite efficiency, had erased them completely, not with fire, but with paperwork. Every now and then, though, a few of these heretic children grew up to reclaim their parents' faith, or at least to ask inconvenient questions. One famous example is Clara Bergi, a Swiss girl whose parents were executed for heresy in 1528. Raised by a pious Protestant family, she grew up quietly reading the same forbidden texts that had doomed her parents. When she was caught owning them as an adult, the authorities were baffled. She hadn't been raised heretical. She had become heretical, all by herself. It turns out you can take the child out of the heresy, but not always the curiosity out of the child. Now, before we drift further, let's pause on one question. Why were people so afraid of heretics' children in the first place? Because in medieval logic, belief wasn't just taught, it was inherited. If your parents were sinful, it was assumed their sin had seeped into your very nature. Not metaphorically, literally. Sin was seen as an infection of the bloodline, like a hereditary disease, and Europe loved a good hereditary disease. This is why inquisitors kept detailed genealogies. If your great-grandfather was burned for heresy, that little footnote could follow your family for centuries. In Spain, these records were called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. It wasn't just about religion. It became a full-blown caste system, dividing the pure from the tainted. So even if you were born long after the smoke cleared, your ancestors' heresy could still close doors. No, marriage into respectable families. No, entry into the church. No advancement in royal service. Your family's guilt had become a permanent tattoo. Occasionally, though, something strange happened. A noble family would discover generations later that a revered ancestor had actually been condemned for heresy, at which point their descendants would suddenly remember that, actually, it had all been a misunderstanding. Documents would be reinterpreted, records lost. The church could be remarkably flexible when it came to powerful people. But if you were poor, you stayed tainted forever. There's also a quieter side to all this, one that rarely makes it into history books, because not every child of a heretic was taken or shunned. In small villages, people sometimes ignored the church's rules. There are parish records from the Pyrenees that show local priests quietly baptizing the children of known heretics and recording them as legitimate parishioners. The poor priests themselves risked punishment, but they did it anyway. Because even in the Middle Ages, compassion occasionally outmaneuvered bureaucracy. These children might grow up never knowing their parents had been executed, or maybe they knew, and simply learned not to mention it. The art of silence was a survival skill in medieval Europe. By the late Middle Ages, though, heresy began to lose its central terror. The Church had other worries: plague, politics, schism,